The morning Sandra Pelham cut through the padlock on my rear fence gate with bolt cutters she had apparently purchased specifically for this purpose, and swung the gate open onto 14 acres of working farm that she had told 87 people was available for a private event. The first thing that came through that gate was not a catering van or a folding table or a string of bistro lights. It was Clarence. Clarence was my Charolais bull. He weighed 2,140 pounds. He had been standing approximately 30 feet from the gate on the interior side of the fence for the past 40 minutes because I had moved the herd to the east paddock that morning for routine rotation, and Clarence, who was territorial about gates and transitions in ways that his breed was known for, had positioned himself between the herd and the open question of what was happening at the fence line. He was not aggressive in the clinical sense. He was present in the way that a 2,000-pound animal is present when it is paying attention to something it has not resolved yet. Sandra swung the gate open. Clarence took 3 steps forward into the opening. I was 120 yards away on the tractor checking the water line at the southeast corner of the east paddock, and I had my trail camera alert running on my phone because I had installed trail cameras on every gate and fence crossing on my property 12 days earlier when I had received the first indication that Sandra was planning to use my land for an event she had not asked me about. The alert showed me the gate opening in real time. I looked at the camera. I looked at the distance between myself and the gate. I started the tractor. Sandra's catering van, which had pulled up behind her on the farm road, stopped when the driver saw Clarence. Sandra herself had stepped back from the gate with the specific posture of someone who has opened a door and found something on the other side that significantly revised her understanding of the situation. Clarence stood in the gate opening and regarded the situation. He was not threatening. He was simply there in the way that 2,140 pounds is simply there, which is comprehensively and without ambiguity. I arrived at the gate on the tractor at the same time as my farm hand Burl, who had been in the barn and had seen the alert on his own phone, because I had set all 3 of my full-time hands up with camera access 2 weeks earlier specifically for this reason. Burl had a good relationship with Clarence and walked toward him at a measured pace while I brought the tractor around to close off the approach from the roadside. Clarence watched Burl come and then turned and walked back toward the herd with the unhurried authority of an animal that has assessed a situation and found it resolved. I got off the tractor and looked at Sandra. She was 58 years old, a retired marketing director from Nashville who had bought the property adjacent to mine on the western side 2 years ago, and she had spent much of those 2 years developing what she described to people as a vision for the land that I had come to understand meant she had a strong aesthetic sense about what the landscape around her should look like, and a limited appreciation for the distinction between the landscape she owned and the landscape she did not. She said, "You have a bull." I said, "I have a herd. Clarence is the herd bull. You cut my padlock." She said, "I needed access for the event." I said, "There is no event authorized on my property. I told you that 10 days ago in writing." She said, "I have 87 people coming today." I said, "Then you need to contact all 87 people and tell them the event is not happening here because you do not have permission to use this property." She looked at the gate. She looked at the cut padlock lying on the ground. She looked at Burl walking Clarence back toward the herd. She looked at me. She said, "Can we work something out?" I said, "Absolutely not. You cut my padlock. You opened my gate onto a working cattle operation without my knowledge or permission. You invited 87 people to use my land without asking me. We are past working something out." My name is Holt Granger. I am 54 years old, a 4th-generation cattle farmer and hay producer with 31 years of experience managing a working agricultural operation in central Tennessee, and I have owned and operated the Granger family farm on 340 acres of productive land since I was 23 years old. My great-grandfather ran cattle on this ground in 1911. My grandfather improved the pastures in the 1930s and 40s. My father added the hay operation in the 60s and built the infrastructure I have spent 31 years maintaining and expanding. The land is registered as an agricultural property with the county, carries an active agricultural exemption on the tax rolls, and is operated under a comprehensive herd management plan that my veterinarian and I update annually. The farm is not a venue. It had never been a venue. It had been described as a venue by Sandra Pelham to 87 people on a printed invitation that listed my farm road address, included a photograph of my north pasture that she had apparently taken from the public road during a drive-by at some point in the preceding months, and described the location as a private farm estate with rustic charm available through a special arrangement. There was no special arrangement. There had never been a special arrangement. Sandra had come to my door 8 months earlier and proposed one, which I had declined in a conversation I had documented in my farm journal with the date, the time, and the substance of what was said. She had come back 3 weeks later with a figure, a dollar amount she was prepared to pay for 1 day's use of the north pasture and the barn. I had declined again and documented it again. She had sent a handwritten note a month after that suggesting we revisit the conversation in the spring. I had not responded to the note, but I had filed it in my documentation folder. Then the invitations had gone out. I had learned about the invitations from my neighbor to the south, a farmer named Walt Hale who ran a sheep operation and who had a cousin who had received one of Sandra's invitations at a work function in Nashville. Walt had called me 12 days before the event to say that his cousin had shown him an invitation that listed my address. I had pulled the invitation image that Walt's cousin photographed and sent me. It was a formal printed card, the same kind that appeared in other stories in this collection, with my farm road address and the north pasture photograph and the language about special arrangement. I had called James Waller that same afternoon. James had handled agricultural legal matters for my family for 20 years, and he understood working farms and the specific vulnerabilities of agricultural properties adjacent to residential development. He had listened to the full situation and said, "She printed your address on formal invitations without your permission." Again. I said, "Different person, same situation." He said, "How many people?" I said, "The invitation says 87. He said, "Send a letter today. I want it delivered by certified mail and by hand, and I want trail cameras on every gate and access point before the weekend." The letter had gone out. The trail cameras had gone in. Sandra had received the letter. Sandra had proceeded anyway and had cut my padlock. Deputy who arrived 40 minutes after I called the sheriff's department was a woman named Sergeant Linda Reyes, who I recognized from a prior fence dispute 2 years earlier, and who had the composed efficiency of someone who knew this county and knew agricultural properties and was not going to be confused about the relevant facts. She looked at the cut padlock. She looked at the trail camera on the fence post above the gate. She looked at the catering van still parked on my farm road. She said, "You have footage of her cutting the lock." I said, "Time-stamped 4K footage from the camera on the gate post. I also have footage from the approach camera showing her arrival with bolt cutters." She looked at Sandra. She said, "Did you cut this lock?" Sandra said, "I needed access and I was going to replace the lock afterward." Sergeant Reyes said, "You cut a lock on someone else's property to gain unauthorized access." Sandra said, "We had an arrangement." I said, "There is no arrangement. James Waller sent a certified letter 10 days ago. It is in my documentation folder." I handed Sergeant Reyes the folder. She reviewed it for 4 minutes, standing at the fence with the August sun on her back and the folder open in her hands. She looked at the letter. She looked at the trail camera still and the photograph of Sandra's certified mail receipt. She looked at the invitation copy with my address on it. She said she received formal written notice that no arrangement existed, and she came today with bolt cutters. I said yes. Sergeant Reyes charged Sandra with criminal trespass and criminal damage to property for the padlock. The charges were filed at the scene on her body camera with the trail camera footage as supporting evidence. Sandra was issued a citation with a court date and told she was not permitted to remain on or near my property. Sandra called her attorney from the farm road while Sergeant Reyes was completing her paperwork. Her attorney was a Nashville litigator named Philip Cross, who had apparently been retained at some point during the preparation for the event, possibly when Sandra received James's letter and had decided to obtain legal cover rather than legal guidance. Philip arrived at my farm 40 minutes after Sandra called him, which suggested he had been somewhere in the county, possibly in anticipation of the situation. He spoke with Sandra privately for 10 minutes, then he came to me. He said, "My client acknowledges that the situation today went further than she intended, and she wants to resolve it appropriately." I said, "Your client cut my padlock and opened my gate onto a working cattle operation. Clarence is a 2,000-pound herd bull. The herd was 30 feet inside that gate. Have your client contact Philip Webb, that is my attorney, and we will discuss resolution." He said, "The 87 guests." I said, "That is your client's problem." He said, "Many of them are already en route." I said, "That is also your client's problem." Philip Cross went back to Sandra. They had another conversation. Then Sandra got in her car and began making phone calls. The catering van left. Several cars had begun arriving on the public road near my farm entrance, and Sandra was intercepting them, which I watched from my tractor position with the particular satisfaction of someone who has watched a consequence arrive for someone who had the full information required to avoid it and had chosen not to. The event did not happen. 87 people had apparently been told about the change of venue situation over the course of the afternoon, some of them turning around at the farm road entrance, some of them already in the parking area of the event. Sandra had apparently scrambled to arrange at a local pavilion 12 miles away. I do not know how many of them made it to the pavilion. I do not know what the pavilion cost on short notice. I know it was not my problem. James filed the civil claim the following week. It covered the cut padlock, the trail camera and security system costs I had installed specifically in anticipation of this event, James's fees for the 10-day preparation period, and the event day response. The veterinarian consultation I had requested the following morning to assess whether the gate incident and Clarence's agitation had any health implications for the herd, which it had not, but which I had documented anyway. And compensatory damages for the sustained pattern of attempting to use my property without authorization across 8 months of documented interactions. Philip Cross contacted James within a week. The settlement negotiation was brief. The criminal charges had produced a factual record that made the civil claims straightforward, and Philip appeared to understand this. The final settlement was $23,000. Sandra paid it personally. Her homeowner's insurance reviewed the claim and declined coverage because the sustained intentional conduct, documented across multiple months and culminating in a criminal act, fell outside accidental occurrence coverage. The criminal case resolved 3 months after the charges. Sandra pleaded guilty to criminal trespass. The criminal damage to property charge was dropped as part of the plea. She received a fine and a suspended sentence and a criminal record. Philip Cross called James after the plea to say that Sandra had found the process very difficult and that she genuinely had not understood that proceeding without authorization was the kind of thing that produced criminal records. James said that was the kind of information that was generally available in advance of decisions rather than after them, and that the letter had been intended to convey exactly that. The padlock was replaced the same day it was cut. I used a higher grade of hardened steel than the prior lock, a grade that requires cutting equipment more specialized than standard bolt cutters. Burl commented that the new lock was more expensive than what it was protecting, which was a gate latch and a hinge. I said the cost was not about what it was protecting. It was about what it was communicating. A high-grade hardened lock at a farm gate communicates something different than a standard lock. It communicates that the person who put it there understood the distinction between locks that are inconvenient to defeat and locks that require genuine commitment to defeat, and had chosen the latter. Burl said, "You are saying the lock is a message." I said, "All infrastructure is a message if you build it with intention." He thought about this. He said, "What does Clarence communicate?" I said, "Clarence communicates 2,100 140 pounds of unambiguous agricultural reality. He laughed. He said, "She opened that gate and found out." I said, "She opened that gate and found out." I walked the fence line that evening after the herd was settled, the same perimeter check I did every week, testing posts and checking wire and confirming that the trail cameras were positioned correctly and saving to the cloud and that the new lock was properly seated. Everything was in order. The gate was secure. The east paddock was quiet. Clarence was grazing at the far end with the rest of the herd, entirely unconcerned with the events of the morning. He was an animal who lived in the present. What had happened at the gate had happened and was done, and he had moved on to the next thing, which was grazing, because that was what his life required. I found this instructive. Walt Hale came over Sunday afternoon with 2 bottles of beer and sat on the fence rail of my equipment corral. He said, "Heard Sandra cut your lock." I said, "Yes." He said, "Heard Clarence was at the gate." I said, "He walked into the opening." Walt said, "That must have been something to see." I said, "From the tractor camera, it was fairly clear." He said, "Did she see him before she stepped back?" I said, "The camera shows her swing the gate and then step back in approximately 2 seconds. Clarence was 3 steps forward in the first second." Walt was quiet for a moment. He said, 2,000 pounds. I said 2,140 at his last weigh-in. Walt said, "She came with bolt cutters to a farm with a 2,000-pound bull." I said, "She came with bolt cutters to a working agricultural operation." The bull was a feature of the operation she had not accounted for. Walt drank his beer. He said, "The 87 people." I said, "Did not arrive." He said, "That is a lot of people who did not have the event they expected." I said, "Yes, Sandra had to deal with that." Walt said, "The consequences were proportionate." I said, "Yes." He said, "You documented everything." I said, "From the first conversation 8 months ago. Farm journal, photographs, certified mail, trail cameras." He said, "The cameras were installed before she arrived." I said, 12 days before." Walt said, "You anticipated this." I said, "I anticipated that someone who had sent invitations with my address after receiving a certified letter declining authorization was probably going to arrive regardless of the letter. I prepared documentation infrastructure accordingly." He said, "Same way you prepare for a bad storm." I said, "You check the fence lines before the storm, not during." He nodded. We sat for a while in the Sunday afternoon quiet of a farm that was working correctly and would keep working correctly because the people responsible for it had been paying attention. The farm had been here since 1911. It would be here after I was gone if my daughter, who was 26 and learning the operation with the focused intensity of someone who intended to continue it, had anything to say about the matter. She had been working a section of the hay operation herself for 2 years, and she had James's number in her phone and kept her own documentation files and understood that the land required defending with the same systematic attention it required for everything else. She did. That was enough. That had always been enough. Thumbnail text, she cut his lock and opened the gate. She didn't know a 2,100-pound bull was on the other side.